Today we're going to complete the topic of biomes, and we'll finish up that topic by taking a look at marine ecosystems. Once we do that, however, we'll still be looking further at issues concerning the living world. Ecosystem ecology would be a more sophisticated term for that. The first marine ecosystem we'll take a look at is this one right here. We're looking at an estuary, and we could define an estuary as that place where fresh water from the upland meets the seawater from the ocean. It's a mixing ground. This particular estuary that we're looking at here is the Connecticut River estuary, which is a fairly sizable estuary on the East Coast. In fact, those kinds of estuarine influences extend all the way up to the city of Hartford in central Connecticut. Estuaries are places where not just water mixes, however, they're also places that are subjected to tides, and over the length of the estuary, the influence of salt water from the ocean and tidal influence changes, tending to be greatest at the mouth of the estuary, where the estuary opens into the ocean, and least at the upper end, that end that is most landward, inasmuch as many estuaries are associated with major rivers. We're talking about upriver regions, and that's the case with this Connecticut River estuary, is that although tidal influence can extend all the way to Hartford, saltwater influence extends only a fraction of that distance, only a matter of miles inland, and seasonally that even changes. During the springtime, salt water is pretty much flushed out of the estuary by all of the winter meltwater coming down the Connecticut River, whereas in late summer, when the Connecticut River is at its low flow for the year, salt water can extend fairly far up that estuary, going miles inland, especially at high tide. Now, as you can see in this and the last picture, estuaries are generally quiet water kinds of environments, relatively low energy environments, in other words. They are often cut off from the ocean by some kind of a barrier. And that's what you're seeing in this photograph here. In the background there is a barrier that separates Long Island Sound from the Connecticut River estuary. That barrier is a sand spit. It's an area of sand that extends out from the mainland and acts as a buffer between the high energy of the ocean and the quiet water of the estuary. Now, many estuaries have sand spit features like this, but they may also have islands of sand that sit in front of them, referred to then as barrier islands. So the south coast of Long Island, the coast of New Jersey, and further south along the southeast all have extensive areas of barrier islands. Sand spits and barrier islands can become quite large and extensive. This one, for example, on the north shore of Cape Cod extends for miles, and it's quite wide, and it develops a very characteristic flora, vegetation in other words, that grows on the sand dunes. This particular one serves as a barrier for the bay that is behind it. And a bay, that area of quiet water behind a barrier, is generally also an estuary. It's a place where freshwater streams or rivers might enter, and so you get a gradient of salinity in the water and a gradient in the amount of tidal action that's present. But let's return to the estuary itself. We're looking at one here from the south coast of Rhode Island. Not the giant estuary of Narragansett Bay, but a smaller bay found to the west of that, bordered by a barrier beach, and then behind that beach is what you see here. This, again, quiet water environment with a mixing ground between salt and fresh water. And in this quiet water environment, sediments can settle out of the water, and you get the development of this kind of an environment here, a tidal marsh. In rather salty water like you find here, it's called a salt marsh, because only certain kinds of plant species are capable of growing in this rather saline water. Salt marshes in eastern North America actually have an immense range. They extend from Canada, and that's where this one is here. If you look in the background, you might be able to see the spires of some spruce trees. This one is on Prince Edward Island in Canada, at about the northern range limit of salt marshes. And in this picture here, you see characteristics of salt marshes that are generally associated particularly with some of the northern marshes. There's a meadow-like area that covers much of this picture, which is called a salt meadow or high marsh area, which is not inundated by tides as frequently as other parts of the marsh. And right at the upland border, you notice this band of darker vegetation. This is a distinct plant community on the salt marsh, often referred to as the black grass zone. It's actually not a grass, though. It's a kind of a rush in the genus Juncus that forms this boundary. As we get towards the southern end of the continent, we find salt marshes growing in association with palm trees. This salt marsh is present in northern Florida, which is about the southern range limit. When you get a little further south from here, the salt marshes give way to mangrove swamps, which is a tropical kind of a wetland community that develops in estuaries. Now, this salt marsh, like many on the southeastern coastal plain, is comprised of mostly what's referred to as low marsh, that area which is inundated by tides pretty much every day. So much of the surface of the marsh here is that low marsh. Let's return to New England for some further discussion of these marshy kinds of areas that occur associated with estuaries. There's actually not just one kind of marsh community that occurs in these. We're looking here at a small estuary on the south coast of Massachusetts, where a freshwater river enters the ocean. Along the edge here, you see a fringe of salt marsh, and in this case, the border is covered with this purplish kind of a plant, which is a particularly attractive salt marsh species. It's called salt marsh lavender. It goes by a couple of different names, sea lavender. And in the fall, September, about then, it has these clusters of lavender flowers that can accent the edge of the salt marsh, and can even find them in areas on the high marsh, in larger, more extensive kinds of salt marsh communities. But in any event, that salt marsh is associated with the parts of the estuary that are subjected to the greatest tidal influence and also tend to be subjected to the most salinity. As soon as water salinity starts to drop, this community also disappears. In large estuaries that have a number of marshes along their length, the salt marshes tend to give way to communities like this, where the water is only slightly salty, the so-called brackish water marsh communities. The common reed that you see in this picture here is typical of these brackish water areas. Now, common reed is often described as an invasive species in eastern North America, and indeed that is true. We do have a native variety of common reed that was here long before Europeans ever got here, but what we find being the invasive form is this Eurasian variety that is much more aggressive and manages to come to dominate communities. Once upon a time, much of what you're looking at here would not have been vegetated by common reed, but would have been vegetated by cattails. In fact, if we look at these two photographs that I've taken many years apart, you can see the change in the community. This first photograph I took in 1974, and the next one I took 20 years later. And over that intervening period of time, this brackish marsh community went from one that had quite a bit of cattail cover and even a little bit of salt marsh vegetation still in it, to one which is dominated by largely common reed. Management efforts have been developed to try to control some of these common reed stands and replace them with other kinds of marsh vegetation which are more attractive to North American kinds of wildlife. It's not that wildlife won't use these reeds, but it tends to be a richer community of animals associated with some of these other kinds of plant associations that occur in this brackish water environment. Now, if one continues on up an estuary, and often this also means going upriver, then the influence of salinity drops out altogether, and you can get the development of a tidal freshwater marsh, and that's what you see right here. The gloominess of this picture is because I took it, probably 15-20 minutes before dawn. I have spent many years out in places like this studying the kinds of animals, notably the birds that live in them. And marsh birds get up awfully early, which means that I had to get up awfully early. And so I have many photos of marshes at that very early morning kind of a state. You can notice, if you look carefully though, that there is mud along the edges of this creek here. And that's because when I took this photograph, it was low tide. The freshwater marsh communities tend to be rather more diverse than the brackish and salt marsh communities. It's a less extreme environment, less harsh, less difficult to make a living is another way to say it, and consequently quite a few more species are capable of colonizing these kinds of areas. So for example, whereas we might have been looking at 2, 3, 4 species dominating the surface of the marsh in the previous photographs, in this one there's quite a few. We're looking at tussock sedges and bulrushes of several different species, and water horsetail, which is a very primitive plant that grows in these marshes. We're looking at pickerel weed, which has these floating leaves in the water, and you can get water lilies and a whole host of other kinds of things, smartweeds and cattails of several species, and just a bunch of different things. So we can summarize some of these sorts of observations like this. You can, by the way, find estuaries in a whole variety of different kinds of climatic regimes around the world. In temperate parts of the world, salt marsh kinds of communities develop in the saltiest parts of these estuaries, whereas in these salty areas in tropical regions you find mangrove swamps. The limiting factor would be water salinity and tidal fluctuation. Found throughout the world, and there are a number of specialist kinds of species that occur in these environments. You're looking here at the sharp-tailed sparrow, which is a very widespread coastal species on the east coast of North America, living in salt marshes exclusively, generally associated more with the high marsh than with the low marsh, although they certainly do use this area, and in fact I've often seen them many times at low tide hopping around on the tidal mudflats that are exposed, feeding on them as well. The sharp-tailed sparrow has a relative, this one here, the seaside sparrow, rather different looking bird, that is also a salt marsh specialist. Generally thought of as being more of a low marsh bird, but again, the relationship between them is more complex than that, and in fact, even though both of these species have been studied extensively, and I've looked at them quite a bit myself, my feeling is that there's still much to be learned about the ecological relationships of these species. One other species associated with estuarine marshes is this one here. This is the least bittern, which is fairly common over a good part of eastern North America, although it is exceedingly secretive and remains to this day one of the least known of North America's bird species. They tend to not live so much in salt marshes, but more in brackish marshes associated with reeds, and you see them perched on a reed right here, and cattails. Although you can also find them in other kinds of stiff-stemmed freshwater marsh species, like the bulrush. The river bulrush is a species that, superficially at least, looks a bit like a cattail and having a real strong stem and being quite tall. It is a fish-eating bird and can be found hunting along creeks. I was drifting down a creek one evening in a canoe, not paddling, and I just happened to drift right past this guy. He couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 feet away from me, so I just lifted up my camera and got his photo. Let's turn our attention now to marine ecosystems, such as you see here in this photograph from the coast of Rhode Island, in an area where these pink bedrock outcrops punctuate the shoreline very dramatically, especially towards sunset when that sunlight changes its appearance and floods these little pink outcrops in this very soft kind of light. So we're looking here at a much more high energy environment, and you can see the waves here and the ripples on the waves and all that. This much higher energy environment with waves driven by wind, with substantial tidal change during the course of the day as a consequence of the action of the moon's gravitational pull and the sun's gravitational pull on the earth. We can define these marine ecosystems rather simply like this. They are found certainly throughout the world. In fact, marine ecosystems are the most widespread ecosystems on planet Earth. The vegetation of the ocean, there are actually several kinds of higher plants that do colonize the nearshore environment. There is, in bays, you can find things like a plant called eelgrass. You can find in tide pools little scraggly things called widgeon grass, all of which are rather important wildlife foods, especially for waterfowl, ducks and geese. But the premier photosynthetic organisms of the ocean are much more primitive, the ancestors of those higher plants, in fact, the marine algae, of which there are a number of groups. There are the red algae and the brown algae, and the golden brown algae and the green algae. We're looking here at a picture of several species of brown algae that are floating in this tide pool, attached to rocks, not by roots. Algae are very primitive and don't have roots, but attached by something called a holdfast to the rocks. There are quite a variety of animals that are associated with the marine environment, including birds like this fairy tern, which is a widespread species in the world's tropics, but also species like this. This is a lionfish, which is a rather common species in tropical regions of the Pacific Ocean. It is associated with coral reefs, which is another kind of a environment that occurs in marine ecosystems in tropical parts of the planet. Here we see one on a Pacific island where you can tell the presence of the coral reef by that turquoise kind of color in the water. The edge of that turquoise is the edge of the reef where it can drop off into deep water, and you'll have like a wall descending upon which a whole variety of different coral species and fish species and a host of other kinds of organisms live. Coral reefs tend to be immensely diverse kinds of places. During my years in the tropics, I went snorkeling at least 3 or 4 days a week. And during that time, I logged over 1,000 different species of fish. I kept a checklist every time I saw a new species. And it was just astonishing to me that there were so many different kinds of things associated with these coral reefs. Now, in the foreground of this picture, you also see ancient coral reefs that were uplifted from the ocean and now are coral rock. And if you look very carefully, you might be able to see the fossilized remains of some of those corals making particular kinds of patterns in these rocks. Now, if you look in the background here, you'll also notice that there's a little islet just off the shore of this bigger island. Little islets like that often become seabird colonies. There are a whole host of different species of birds that make their living on the ocean and only come on to land to build their nests and lay their eggs. Here's an example of one species. This is a frigate bird. This is the great frigate bird, in fact, which I think is the largest species of frigate bird in the world, widespread in the tropical Pacific. It is a predatory bird, and even though it nests in colonies with some of these other species, like this one here, brown booby, the frigate bird is a predator on the nestlings of some of these other species. When they get the chance, they'll snag one. They are huge things in the neighborhood of, with wingspreads of 6 or more feet. Spend much of their life just cruising over the open ocean, and then they'll come back to the nesting colony to roost and to lay their eggs. And of course, mammals live in the ocean as well. This is a North Atlantic humpback whale. There are separate populations in the Atlantic and the Pacific. And these are are fairly readily found not too far off of the east coast of North America. Among the largest mammals in the world. There are other species. I think these humpback whales average about 60 feet in length, but there is another species, the finback, which is larger, and then the blue whale is the largest of all. They are not predatory. At least these species are not predatory. They actually filter feed. They have these plates called baleen that they filter seawater through, and they get these tiny organisms out of the water, and that's how they make their living. Let's turn our attention now to the kinds of habitats that you find in the marine realm. That area very close to the shore, which is exposed at low tide to the air and then inundated at high tide, is called the intertidal zone. It has its own community of organisms that are capable of living in those rather difficult kinds of conditions, where half the day you have to be a marine organism and the other half of the day you have to cope with being exposed to air. The area below that is referred to as the pelagic environment, the area that's always covered with water. The seafloor itself is called the benthic environment, much like we refer to the bottoms of lakes as the benthic environment. And from shallowest to deepest, it's given special names. The shallowest parts of the ocean are referred to as the bathyal realm, whereas deeper regions are referred to as the abyssal realm, and the deepest of all are called the hadal zones. These benthic environments include things like coral reefs that we saw in previous pictures, as well as eelgrass beds that you find in estuaries. And on the west coast especially, you can find these areas of kelp, these very long brown algae anchored to the seafloor that form something like a marine forest. We do have species of kelp also on the east coast, but nothing like some of these west coast kelp beds. Within the pelagic environment, that portion of the water column through which light can penetrate is called the euphotic zone. This is where you find floating single-celled algae, organisms like that. We can also divide up the pelagic environment horizontally into the Neritic province, which overlies the continental shelves, and the oceanic province, which is the deep ocean. Let's take a look at a diagram of all this. This is a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration diagram that illustrates some of these and even subdivides some of those environments a little further, and giving some of these things special names. That euphotic zone they are referring to in this diagram as the epipelagic zone. Notice also in this diagram they illustrate the edge of the continental shelf descending in a continental slope to the ocean basin. And then in those very deep parts of the ocean, again, you can see the hadal zone. At this point, we have pretty much come to the end of our overview of the world's biomes. And I'll end on this slide, which is one prepared by the U.S. Soil Conservation Service, now by its new name, that illustrates the world's distribution of the major biomes. And you can see the gray areas that correspond to the tundra in the far north of the northern hemisphere. The white areas are areas that are under ice. Then we have pale green areas that are associated with temperate seasonal forest, and deeper green areas associated with rainforest. The pinks are associated with desert, although the deepest pinks are that Mediterranean chaparral vegetation. The tropical savannas are in orange, and temperate grasslands are in yellow, although some of the drier grasslands are also illustrated in pink in this. So we actually do have a couple more things to say about biomes, but I'm going to hold off until next time to say them. So we will finish up the last couple bits of biomes next time, and then we will begin our next topic under the heading of the living world.